lot about Korean shamans. I've seen lots of kut. I know Frank is an expert in his own right, and some of you very little. And in any case, the word shaman is used very broadly, and I want to be very clear about what I mean. Okay, a shaman is not a spirit medium, is not someone who goes into trance and gets taken over one-on-one and becomes the god's puppet. A shaman is not just a fortune teller, although they do give divinations. And there are today plenty of people who are just Chongjengi fortune tellers in Korea who take on the trappings of Munshin, but aren't really the authorized certifiable Munshin. Okay, classic anthropology. S.I. Shirokogorov. A shaman is a master of the spirits, usually for the good of the community, but they have power, and power can be dangerous, and shamans can be feared. In Korea, the negative power of the shaman translates into rumors of people hiring them to attack their business rivals, their romantic rivals, etc. Shamans engage the spirits either by encountering them during soul flight or by bringing them into the here and now. Either way, the presence of the spirits is made visible, palpable in ritual space. The shaman uses his or her own body to indicate the presence of spirits. In Siberia, they exhibit a static movement, animal cries, seemingly inexplicable feats, or graphic manifestations of divine presence, a spectacular break with quotidian reality. And this is part of the fascination that shamans hold for scholars and ordinary people. Okay, so that's the classic Siberian shaman and the people who gave us the word itself. All right, Korean Munshin do not experience soul flight. They are the sort of shamans who bring the gods into the here and now. Shamans' encounters with spirits become visible. In Korea, this is accomplished through voice, mime, costumes, and extraordinary feats intended to prove the presence of gods. They have, in Korea, been broadly called mudang, and Munshin, 10,000 gods, is a subset of that broad category of mudang. Professor Im Sok-jae, distinguished folklorist, whom some of you may know as the father-in-law of our late colleague Roger Janelli, he was very concerned when Koreans started reading Marcia Eliade and doing Eliade-esque interpretations of mudang. And he wanted to set the record straight, what a mudang is, and who the real mudang are and who the non-mudang are in the Korean popular religious spectrum. He said, true mudang are those who sing and dance to gain the favor of the gods. In other words, actively engaging the gods to gain their favor and to expel, and to be empowered to expel nasty forces, malevolent ghosts, inauspicious humors, and so on. In other words, to be a master of the spirits. But in the Korean case, to accomplish this by being a skilled entertainer of the divine, Munshin will sometimes say, we are the kiseng of the spirits. We're the ones who entertain them and make them happy, so they do the things we want them to do. Yin considered true mudang to be the Tanggol mudang of the South, who were traditionally hereditary. Today, they were also considered outcast, and many tried to hide it, escape it. Today, this is a very precarious category. They've taken into their ranks inspired shamans. They have also adapted a lot of the trappings of the Munshin. Then there are the Shimbang of Jeju Island, and then the people I will be talking about, the Munshin, who are the most colorful, the costume, the ones who put painted images in their shrines, the ones who do full body manifestations of gods and ancestors operating through inspiration. They are the most iconic And in Korea today, their costumes, their pictures, their modes of ritual are broadly absorbed into the practices of others who are not in the Munshin tradition. When I went to graduate, yes, and another thing about Mudang in general, Munshin in particular, not all, but most are women. And this is what initially interested me very much as a Peace Corps volunteer, because this was one domain in Korean society where women really seemed to be at the center of the action, and where if I chose to study as an anthropologist, my gender would not get in the way. So I went to graduate school, and one of the questions I carried with me was, how do they get away with it? It was a very good time to be studying women in the early 70s. There was a lot of interest in what we initially called the anthropology of women. How do societies look if we factor women in, if we look through the perspectives and strategies of women? And there was also an important theoretical work out there for me to argue with, and that was a real gift. I'm speaking of a book called A Static Religion by a British anthropologist called I.M. Lewis. He built on a large body of work about African spirit possession cults in various North African societies. And he and others had interpreted this phenomenon as women fighting back. Women are marginalized, women go into spirit possession, and in spirit possession, they demand pretty clothes, and they demand perfume, and they demand good food, and dancing, and music. So he characterized women in possession religions as an oblique regressive strategy. That was his word. And then he said, shamans, on the other hand, you find shamans where shamans are not peripheral, they're central, they're at the middle of the action. And in those cases, of course, they're always men. Well, I was pretty sure that the women I had seen were shamans, that they were not just spirit cult devotees, that they were people who were doing what they did for clients, for the benefit of other people, that it was more important than the personal gratification that was being ascribed to possession cult devotees. And I set out to explore this with my first field work. Well, so some basics. How does one become a Munshin? As is typical of shamans in other places, male and female, and already well known for Korea, they're chosen, mysterious illness, dreams, misfortune, uncanny behavior. They resist, they resist, they resist, their families resist, and finally so much is going wrong, so much is bad that they capitulate and are initiated. Some successfully, some not successfully. Many initiation could fail. Then they have a long, hard journey to master all the things you need to know to be a Munshin. You need, as a professional, you need to know how to do offerings, how to recognize deities, how to give appropriate chants. You also need to cultivate the goodwill of the spirits through prayers, through mountain pilgrimages, so that they will give you the kind of inspiration you need as a Korean woman who used to be an ordinary Korean woman to be able to get up there and in costume, in voice, with the confidence of inspiration to speak the will and words of the gods. And to do this in such a compelling way that in their perspective, the gods are pleased, the ancestors are made peaceful, and everything is good luck, good fortune. Or, as the anthropologist sees it, to be so compelling in all of this that when the Munshin is sufficiently skilled, sufficiently inspired, the clients experience an emotionally satisfying ritual process. Kut, as many of you know, as some of you have seen, is the Munshin's most elaborate ritual. The gods appear in sequence in the same bright costumes they wear in the pictures that hang above the altar. Though the Munchen's costumed body, through her dancing, singing, miming, and declarations, the gods become mobile and articulate. Intimate details of family histories pour through the Munchen's lips, through the words of the gods and the ancestors, a mingling of criticism, sympathy, body humor, threats of dire imprecation, and promises of good fortune. In Kut, the costumes, the offering food, the props, the percussive music redefine time and space out of the ordinary. Boldly colorful things, piles of offering food, theatrical weaponry, and especially the succession of red, blue, yellow, white, and green costumes the shaman wears, combined with other sensory stimuli, percussive music, incense, cups of wine, to enable the presence of a god speaking and moving in the body of a mortal woman. Feats as signs of extraordinary power. The signature feat of a Munchin, standing on iron blades that have been placed on top of a precarious tower. Not all Munchin do this. Only those with a knife-riding general in their pantheon do this, but it is, it's a showstopper moment. Most important, I would say, the Munchin is able to make the gods an immediate presence, to draw people into an engagement, a conversation with gods, with ancestors. You see at the far right, the Munchin is tugging the ear of a high school age girl, and she's saying, "You've got to go to school. You really make your mother worry so much. You are misbehaving, shape up and go to school." And she keeps tugging on that ear. And I believe that's very effective family therapy. The woman in the middle, okay, you see an old woman with the chok, and she's speaking to the Samshin Harmony, the birth spirit, the spirit who resides in the inner room, who is also in some sense combined, taken on some of the attributes of ancestral women in the family. And they're having a very engaged, very concerned exchange there together. And on the far left, it's a bad picture. I was not a great photographer, but the woman in everyday clothes is laughing at what the lineage ancestress is in the yellow and red, holding the shaman's bells, is telling her. They're having a rather amused, delightful exchange. And again, in the end, the goal being to leave the clients feeling purged and hopeful at the end of a ritual. The language of the ritual is open wide the gates of fortune. Let all these good, your path is no longer blocked. You can go forward. This is said again and again and again. If the Munchin has compatibility with the gods in her shrine, the gods give her the inspiration, the myungi, to do this. They give her the oral and visual cues that, still figuring out how to manipulate all of this. They give her oral and visual cues, including vivid dreaming, body sensations, physical illness, troubled dreams are read as signs and indications of divine displeasure that must be righted, because all right, the Munchin gets cues, or she may not get cues, but she has to use her intuition, and she has to say what the gods want to be said. And if she messes up, even when she's on her own, even when they're not helping her, if she messes up and doesn't say the right thing, the Munchins say they get punished. And I can say, based on very close association with a Munchin over many, many years, the times when she feels her luck is down, when she gets sick, when things go wrong in her families, that this is taken absolutely, absolutely seriously. The pressure on them to be true conduits of divine intention, even when in effect what they're doing might be called play acting. It's got to be true play acting. The rituals that Munchin perform are rituals of immediate encounter, or at least they were when I studied them in rural settings in the 1970s. Here you see the shaman in the headgear, on the left, she's got the blue vest with the red sleeves, and she has wrapped around her head a kind of stylized version of mourner's gear. This is the death messenger who comes to snatch the deceased family member away to the courts of hell, the Saja. Griffin Dix also wrote about the Saja, and I believe, and if I'm remembering correctly, or at least you had the Hueshim Gok, the words of the song, the mourner's chant, that is a part of this ritual also. The death messenger has snatched a piece of fruit from the tray that's intended for the ancestor, and they're saying, no, your food's over here. And the death messenger is saying, ha ha, you weren't vigilant enough. And then here, the death messenger is threatening to beat. She's carrying a sort of a stand-in for the dead soul, a fish wrapped in mourner's cloth and hemp, like a shroud. And the women are handing over money to bribe the death messenger. This is also done in mortuary rites so that the dead will be treated properly. Now, counter to the expectation that women's rituals were a subversion of men's ends, it became obvious that these were rituals for the good of the household, or in village kut, for the good of the entire community, win the good graces of the tutelaries, drive out things unclean and inauspicious. In retrospect, though, I think the work made another important contribution. In those days, indeed, even in these days, when people go to work, especially under the banner of national folklore, the intention is to list the pantheon, chart the pantheon, find a generalized national pantheon. And this, yes, there is a standard set of deities. They're recognizable in their images. But I would learn that the gods in individual families are sometimes inflected with ancestral presence, that they're there because of something to do with grandma or granddad or some distant ancestor who carried a knife and a sword and served in the palace. The birth grandmother, Samchin Halmoni, you've seen this picture a few slides ago, Sambul Chesok, is commonly understood as a god, but in the Kut, she is portrayed as a potent mother-in-law. She's crabby the way mothers-in-law are crabby when they don't get their due. She's benevolent because ultimately she wants good for the family. And it might be that a mother-in-law who was very rigorous in prayers, you know, she would go out to the tangokde, to the storage jars, and set light candles and offer rice and pure water. And through her own rigorous prayer, she has the spiritual force to be present as, not just as an ancestor, but as a deity who shows up in Kut. This is even more true in the personal pantheons of the Munshin themselves. In the soul tradition, the Great Spirit Grandmother, Daishin Halmoni, you find in almost every shaman's shrine, and you find in almost everywhere in this portrayal of a shaman in the red skirt, the yellow blouse, with her bells, with her fan, seated at a divination tray where she would cast coins and throw rice. And, but among shamans, your Daishin Halmoni is a shaman who lived in the past, who is possibly, usually, almost always either a remembered ancestor or a remembered shaman teacher, or a not remembered an ancestor who's dimly remembered as having been a shaman or might have been a shaman. Here we are. Here are two. The left one from the American Museum of Natural History, the right one now on the property of the Korea Society, but basically the same deity. Now, when I first knew the Munshin I call Yongsu's mother, her great spirit grandmother was a deceased shaman in her matra line. I'm not sure that, you know, how far back, how clearly remembered. Her own mother, we'll call her Yongsu's grandmother, had a shaman's destiny, but she was never initiated. She was a failed shaman. I once saw her fall into trance, and this was full-on trance, not what Manchin experienced, and deliver an urgent message from the ancestral shaman. Her son and his wife wanted to move the family out of the village, and the ancestral Great Spirit grandmother appeared and said, "I don't want to leave. This is my native place." But this was, of course, also what Yongsu's grandmother wanted. Now, after her death, it was Yongsu's grandmother who appeared as the Great Spirit grandmother in her daughter's shrine. She had sort of been appointed to replace her own ancestress. Oops. And she was qualified to do this because she had a shaman's destiny, even though she never became a shaman. And when she appeared this way, once at a kut, she appears after her death and she sees me and she says, it's been a long time. It's been a while. She's very happy to see me, and we exchanged greetings, and our relationship more or less continued. Yongsu's mother's dead husband serves as spirit warrior in her shrine. He was also an ancestor. He got chesa like an ordinary ancestor, but in Kut, when the spirit warrior appeared, it was him. It was very clearly him. He had died of drink, and you'll notice all the bottles piled up in front of the picture of the great spirit warrior. They would sometimes quarrel. He would appear his persona would appear manifested by one of her colleagues, and they'd start screaming at each other about why isn't her stepson married yet? And then she'd say, well, it's your fault. You're a god. You can do something about it. And I remember, giving her a photograph of her performing kut, and she takes it into the shrine and she slaps it down in front of the image of the god, and she says, "See how pretty your wife is, ha!" So it was a continuing relationship mediated through his becoming one of her deities. Now, after the shaman work in the 1970s, I went on to another project, what became a book called Getting Married in Korea. But I still checked in with a Manchin I call Yongsu's mother, and sometimes accompanied her to ritual events. South Korea was, of course, changing, and so too the Manchin world. The official recognition of Manchin and Kut as national culture, some appointed as national heritage bearers who performed internationally as well as nationally under government sponsorship. This was almost unthinkable when I began. On the one hand, Kut were being performed as large public cultural events, and once identified as national culture, it was okay, even if you were a Christian, to go and hang out and enjoy, because after all, it was culture, it was Korean. On the other hand, personal kut for real people, like the one you see on the left there, these were being held in more restricted circumstances. South Korea had become urbanized. Noise was an issue. There were noise ordinances, some said particularly directed against the Manchin, people living an industrial 9-to-5 time, not going to be kept awake all night the way they could be in a village in the slack season with the drum and the cymbals. There was also a privacy issue. Urban Koreans are much, much more restrained about family matters going public than the people, those of us who got to know them in village settings were. So kut are held in commercial kutdang. They're sponsored by people who may never have seen a kut before. It's a very, very different situation. But what really interested me most about what I was seeing as I checked in with shamans, as I did other work, was the things for which people prayed, which is, of course, a reflection of how people lived and dreamed. The content was changing in some marked ways. One summer evening in 1991, I watched the shaman I call Yongsu's mother perform a small ritual, a kosa, honoring the spirits of a newly purchased family car. This was my first opportunity to observe a car ritual, although Yongsu's mother assured me they were quite common. Now, the owner of the car, Mr. Kim, his mother, had been a good client, a loyal client of Yongsu's mother. And when Mr. Kim married, the expectation was that he and his wife should also come to Yongsu's mother's shrine and make seasonal offerings. They dedicated a prayer cushion. But then the wife became a Christian and dragged the husband into Christian worship. And then, according to Yongsu's mother, things really messed up. They had a small factory, they lost it, business disaster, they had to sell their house. They were repentant, they went back to the shaman, they began to do rituals again, things began to look up, there was an attempt to recuperate the business. But now Mr. Kim, feeling things were better, bought a car. He bought a car without consulting the shaman about whether it was a lucky year for him to buy a car. It was a bad year for him. It was a blocked year. And so she said, we've got to do a kosa for the official of the engine and the official of the car, the cha tegam and the engine tegam. And that was what they did. And you see the couple being exercised in the street in front of the car. And when he drove me back to the subway after the ritual, he explained that he did this for his peace of mind. He felt so much more relieved, and then reminded me of his long association with Yongsu's mother. I began to hear other stories of people whose businesses went bust, stories of people who were, good clients of the shaman, and they survived unscathed while everybody around them in the Namdaemun market had their business go bust. And I began to suspect that business concerns, the precarity of small businesses, was becoming an issue. So I spent summer going from Kutang to Kutang to get a random sample. And it seemed that 2/3 of the Kut that I observed, there was some business crisis precipitating them. And in absolutely every Kut, good wishes for good business were a big part of it. That things were not being held merely for wealth and good fortune, or so the business will go well, but because people were living in such precarious situations that they felt something more than just good wishes and hard work was needed to get them through. And this was consistent with understandings in Korean popular religion of gods and ancestors. Do well by them, honor them, respect them, and they grant you good fortune. Offend them, and they harass you. Manshin and gods adapted to the business world, to new anxieties, new uncertainties. And in imagery, it became common to hear as a shaman chanted in the persona of the gods what she saw in front of her eyes, and she wants to tell someone that good things are ahead of them. And she says, I see you raising a tall building. An imagery that just, wouldn't have existed 100 years ago. This is not a liturgical text. This is not, something that can be frozen in a folkloric study. It's a living practice, a reminder that the conceit of what Manshin can do is bring the gods and ancestors from out there to speak into the here and now, to say something meaningful, psychologically resonant. Now, where does their inspiration to do this come from in their understanding? Well, to answer that question, we're going to take a detour. We're going to Hanoi. Early in the new millennium, I had an opportunity to work with the Vietnam Museum of Ethnology and to make an exhibit which opened in New York in 2003. And it was called Vietnam Journeys of Body, Mind, and Spirit. As part of that exhibit, we were going to show a spirit medium ritual. We were witnessing the mother goddess religion of Vietnam. And to that end, we were gifted, the Museum of Ethnology was gifted by a spirit medium temple, a beautiful set of statues. And then 9/11 happened and we had to cut our budget, so we couldn't send the beautiful statues to New York, and we were looking for substitutes. And the spirit medium was invited to the museum to consult with us about what we could use. She was very disappointed that their gift, how important it was, we didn't yet understand, was not going to be used. On the day she was supposed to show up, and this was one of these pivotal days in my life as a researcher, the conservator said, oh, the statues got dusty in storage, so they took them out and they put them on a wooden platform and they were tidying them up. And the spirit medium arrived and she sees them into her eyes that set on the floor, and she flips out. She says, would you put Ho Chi Minh on the floor? Would you put his statue on the floor? How can you do this? And everybody realized, the understanding of my colleagues is that these were not consecrated statues. They were just statues. The spirit medium was saying they're not consecrated, but they've been dedicated to the mother's work. They've been made the way a consecrated statue is made. And we felt we had a lot more to learn. A few years later, we had the support of a grant for collaborative research from the Rennergren Foundation, and I worked with some Vietnamese colleagues. We went back to the Spirit Medium Temple. We began a study of how statues are understood to be made, how they're understood to be consecrated, tended, disposed of. I learned how these images are regarded as presences, consecrated and ritually enlivened or animated through appropriate techniques and practices. This was a real duh moment for me, because most of my adult life I'd been bowing down in front of Buddhas and having my posture corrected, but I never realized that as part of practice throughout the Hindu Buddhist world, images have an animation packet put inside them, an appropriate mantra recited, and the Buddha is there in ways that the Virgin Mary is not there in a Catholic statue. So to present myself in doing this work, to break the ice, what's this funny foreign woman doing here, talking to us about things that our own government has been telling us were superstitious, and for a period made us cast the statues down, and then the gods got angry and so on. To break the ice and get us into the realm of things unseen, I would tell them a story that Yongsu's mother told me about the images in her shrine. There was a point where the Munshin I know as Chatterbox, her elder sister, retired, and she gave her gods through the medium of her paintings to Yongsu's mother. And Yongsu's mother said, all right, we'll see in 3 months, if everything goes fine, I can accept them, they can come in. And so she put them in her shrine. It was narrow space, so she put hers over the new ones. And then things did not go fine. She was sick, her business fell off. She had a dream where an angry woman tipped the tray of divination rice that belonged to her own great spirit grandmother. She went into the shrine, and lo and behold, her Daishin Harmony and her sisters, Ogwang Sangje, who was her primary spirit, had fallen to the floor and the paintings were stuck together. And she said they had been fighting. Now, it wasn't clear to me, and you can imagine how in Korean syntax this could happen. Did she mean the paintings had been fighting, or the gods had been fighting, the gods through the vehicle of the paintings had been fighting? But anyway, when I told this story, it was, oh yes, you understand. And then I'd get all kinds of cool stuff about statues in Vietnam. So when, on the strength of what I had learned about the animation of statues, the installation of presence in statues, I wanted to go back and learn more about shaman paintings. Something else I had learned in Vietnam was how much fun it was to work as a team. And I joined forces with two scholars who knew a lot more about shaman paintings than I did, Dr. Jung-Soon Yang, who was a student of Roger Ginelli. He was a folklorist, and he was also in his youth, he was working with shamans who told him he ought to get initiated, and he went to the University of Indiana instead, but retained close contacts with that world. And Professor Yun-Yul Su, an art historian who has written a great deal about folk painting, he was a disciple of Dr. Zhou Jiayong, who some of you know, the guy who did all the books about tiger paintings and diamond mountain paintings and so on. So, you know, there's a strong sense of lineage in this project. Okay, now we're not talking about statue bodies, but about two-dimensional paintings on laminated paper, sometimes even cheap, garish, mechanically reproduced prints. When Munshin installed Buddha images on their altars, this is a relatively recent practice, they mimic Buddhist eye-opening rituals or hire monks to do this for them. In the Buddhist world, animation is in the container of the statue body has a liturgical certainty. You do the ritual right, and you've got a Buddha inside the image. Carrying my expectations from the Vietnam work, I asked how the gods enter the paintings, and I encountered a certain vagueness. We cause the gods to be there, one Munshin said, and no, there's no special ritual for this. The gods do go into the paintings. The Munshin needs them to be seated in the paintings in order to receive Nungi, in order to be inspired. And this is supposed to happen when the Munshin sees them in front of her eyes as part of the initiation ritual. I realized that Diana Lee and I had actually captured such a moment on film in 1989. And what you see in the clip is the young apprentice, Chini, about to go up on the knife blades for the first time.
내가 손수 눌려서 이렇게 내밀려줄 거야. 예, 그렇습니다. 다 오죠, 그럼. 다 오죠, 그럼. 잡대에서 안 올리시면 내일 풀려고. 다 천지신명 갖고 신명 다 오셨는데. 자, 이거 들고.
Okay, she says it would have been a disaster if you'd gone all the way up there and nothing had happened. Earlier in the Kut, when Chini's having trouble, you know, having anything, feeling anything, seeing anything, the shaman says, you're the one who has to make it happen. In effect, you have to act like a god in order to become the god. And then, somewhat overwhelmed, the apprentice reaches the point, is overwhelmed with inspiration, sees the gods when she's supposed to, oops. Like much in shaman practice, though, it's all a bit ambiguous. The gods might not arrive at all, and the initiation fails, and the paintings go back to the shop, or a charlatan Munshin performs as though they were present, but the paintings are empty. The gods might arrive without sufficient force to truly empower the Munshin, as, alas, was the case in the segment you just saw. She got on top of the knife, she saw the gods, but she never felt sufficiently empowered to have a career as a Manchin. It was a failed kut. When a Manchin performs kut, and when she does other simpler rituals and basic divination, she's enabled or should be enabled by that flow of divine inspiration that comes through the paintings. Through the gods seated in the paintings, bright energy enables her to make the gods present in words and action. She opens her clients' gates of fortune and chases unclean and inauspicious things from their path. It is her ability to call forth the things from out there. And it is the paintings that are in part the intermediary between the costume shaman in the here and now, and whatever is out there that can't be seen. This is an ongoing relationship where the transmission of inspiration through the paintings can turn staticky, and once present gods might depart in a fit of pique, leaving the Manchin to silence, no voices, no dreams, no visions, no bodily cues or other intuition. Sometimes she can make it right again, as Youngsu's mother did, when the gods in her paintings fought and fell to the floor, and sometimes not. The shaman fosters a good relationship through her own daily devotions, purifications, pilgrimages to sacred mountains to recharge her spiritual batteries, an analogy some shamans use themselves. I came to see the Manchin's body, the shrine, and the mountain as something like electrical circuitry, circuitry, the Manchin transmitting back from the mountain to the shrine, the gods seated in the images providing a steady flow of inspiration back to the Manchin in the form of words, bodily sensations, dreams, visions, or probably most often good intuition. But I might never quite have seen this, quite have entered into the conversations that enabled this understanding if I hadn't looked at the temple statues in Vietnam and then gone back to Korea, as one always wants to go back to Korea. So that's all the formal remarks. I understand that it might be possible to have time for questions if that's desired.
Wow, thank you, Laurel. Let's give Laurel a round of applause. That was wonderful, really, really great.
Well, thank you.
Would you like to ask some questions to Laurel? She's entertaining questions. Charlie?
Charlie, wake up.
Mute. Fascinating, Laurel. Thank you so much. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to just ask a couple. The first one has to do with the distinction. You said that Manchin are kind of subset of the category that where you called Mudang,
Yeah.
which is a term that I think everybody's familiar with.
Yeah.
More
Although
familiar
they
with.
themselves don't like it.
Yeah, I wonder actually to what extent Koreans themselves are familiar with that distinction and know Manchin versus Mudang. But my main question is, what is the distinction? And you say that Mudang is a larger category.
Yeah.
And how can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Oh, okay. Well, I gave you Im Sok-jae's definition that Mudang are those who sing, dance, perform to gain the favor of the spirits, as a basic distinction. And I think by what he means there is that there are a lot of categories of person in Korea who can do divinations, can do some simple prayers, can maybe capture a spirit in a bottle. But the ones who are really able to move the divine in very powerful ways through the music, through the body motion, and then get a charge of inspiration back, those are the people he would call Mudang. Now, he was partial in his work and in his life to the Tango Mudang of the South, the ones who would grow up with the music. They were not supposed to be possessed, but they were, by virtue of birth, they had this special possibility of connecting and gaining the goodwill of the divine through music and dance. And because they were born into these families, they were very, very skilled performers. So Che Gil-song went on to do more research on them, and he notes, among other things, that mid-career, often women from Tanggol Mudang families would go up to Seoul and become kisang. And then when they got too old for that, they would come back and be Tanggol Mudang. Yeah.
Just to follow on, in my own experience, I didn't really have very much. A couple times in Seoul, I did see what I think would properly be called manchin, performing, dressed in full regalia and with the pictures and everything that you described that looked a lot like what you showed us today. But for the most part, when I actually saw mudangs in practice, they were in the countryside, and they were not quite so elaborate, and they were there to help people with physical illnesses, with particular problems, and they would call in a mudang. They would call a mudang, always a woman, always somebody sort of lower class, to kind of, exercise maybe isn't exactly the right word, but it's sort of close, to find out what, to appeal to the spirit world. So find out what is the cause of this problem, and what do we need to do in order to help this person.
Okay.
And that was basically what a mudang was about.
Okay. So if people around you are calling them mudang, I'm not going to fight them.
Yeah.
But what I would say is that when we translate what they are into English, I need to know an awful lot more about the presumptions of what they're doing before I call them a shaman.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Can I?
Yeah.
Are you done?
I'm done. Is Charlie done?
Well, I please, I have other questions, but please, others should take the stage.
Well, my experience was similar to yours, Charlie. And when I was studying a small village, I observed several, koot, and a shaman, a mudang, would be called in from outside of the village. One was a male, actually. And it was because someone was sick. And in one case, I remember, although I may have forgotten some of the details, a boy was sick and they wanted to know why and what they could do to make him well again. And the mudang came in and people crowded around, including me, in a small room, and the woman chanted and beat a drum for like at least 12 hours, and everybody sort of went into a trance, essentially, with breaks for meals. And finally, a spirit was said to more or less, her own personal spirit, as I understood it, was said to come and speak through her body and explain what was the problem. Actually, before she even got started, she did a little sort of miracle, and they put out a great big tub that they put the winter kimchi, in under the ground, a huge tub, and she walked around the rim of this tub.
Okay.
Which was quite a feat.
Okay.
Literally, a feat.
I mean, it was not easy to do. And anyway, so she chanted and beat the drum for hours and hours. Finally, the spirit possessed her and said, well, this is because the daughter of this family had committed suicide, and her spirit was wandering in the other world and unhappy, and you need to go and make offerings here and there, and then her spirit will be appeased. So that was one of them. And then a different one, the male Mudang came from, and he started using little acupuncture needles and sort of putting them into the person who was sick, which I didn't much appreciate.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm
Yeah.
curious to know what you
Okay.
think of those.
Okay, well, I'm not going to be a gatekeeper on this. I
Yeah.
think Professor, I brought Yim Sok Jae into this to make it very clear what I was talking about and why something like inspiration is important in that operation.
Yeah.
And also, I think to distinguish from all kinds of very simple divination, prayer, etc. But what you're describing, I wish Professor Yim was around. This, this is what I think people describe as Anjin Gori Kut, where the Manshin sits and goes through the Gori of the Kut and does things. By his, dance and sing for the gods, I don't know where it would count. I just wish we had more, and I'm glad you guys got what you got.
I have a question. Probably it's a little bit less specific, I think, maybe more general, being an ignorant non-Korean K anything Peace Corps person. My question is, you mentioned that Dr. Lewis way back when said that the reason he thought it was peripheral power, the women had this peripheral power in Africa, but in Korea, they're central. The women are the Munchin mostly, if I understand you correctly. How did that come about? Why is it mostly women and not men? What is the theory behind that?
Okay, I'll give you my theories behind that.
Cool.
Okay, there's a who they are and there's a what they do. And in terms of the what they do, there are traditions throughout Asia, and the oldest, very peripheral, very sparse records of what might be something shaman-like in very ancient China. It's women dancing in a manner that's intended to draw and seduce the gods. There are traditions throughout Southeast Asia of courtly-like behavior and regal, royal-like deities who are incarnated in dancing mediums. So there is a certain sense of dance coming out of courtly traditions as a way of appealing to, petitioning, seducing, gaining the goodwill of. And a lot of sort of blur and bleed between the performing arts. I mean, most literally with these Tango women who become Kiseng and then become Tango Mudang again. But with Manshin, one of the reasons they're considered outcast and disreputable is that the gods show up and they start selling wine around. And they, there's sometimes a little bit of flirtation in it, and sometimes ways they have to defend themselves against a man's advancement, like, oh, the spirit official jabbed the guy. It wasn't me. There's that. Now, in practical terms, in terms of how it works, it's one of the cliches of Korean society. Woman's the inside person, man's the outside person. And people take this very literally as, women are housewives and men are out in society. No, it's men are the public face and women are dealing with the realm of intimacy. And in that realm of intimacy, there are all kinds of things that, men defending public face aren't going to talk about. a woman goes to a female shaman and a ritual is held that the men sort of hover in the corners during, where in that sort, if you want to buy the oblique regressive strategy, you could say, yeah, this is a ritual of rebellion, everything's flipped, but people are doing it and taking it seriously, and it's for the ultimate good of the household. The Korean cultural nationalist scholars will always say it's about harmony, but they don't tell you about what it's against. The adultery, the kid who ran off with the credit card, the mother-in-law, daughter-in-law conflict, the bankruptcy, all this stuff that isn't really part of your public proper presentation of self, but needs to be dealt with to restore this precious harmony.
I have,
I have a question. Yeah, Laurel, thank you so much. What you have brought, the question that I have for you, have you compared the content of your studying of the Korean shamanism and other shamanisms with the kind of resacralization that's happening in Western culture through LSD, through Stanislav Grof, and through Christopher Beisch? Because in some ways, for me, this is more real. What you're talking about is more real than the everyday reality that we think is real. I mean, that's just my own experience. But have you thought about the connection between those two?
Okay. I am in conversation with shaman scholars, including some neo-shamans and people who've worked with neo-shamans. I had one conversation with Michael Harner, who was,
okay. I know him, yes.
He was an anthropologist who worked with the Hivaro and the Hivaro shamans. And he initially was making a case for hallucinogenic spirituality. And then he said, no, there are other techniques and they're better and they get you there quicker. And my argument with him and his disciples, where I certainly respect the sincerity of neo-shamans and the whole movement and the practice, and I accept the validity of it as a spiritualist response to the world. But I feel that it was based on a very orthodox, very doctrinaire view of what a shaman should be. The idea that if it isn't soul flight, spirit flight, it isn't real. I told Michael Harner that the people I knew didn't journey, and he said, oh, I bet they do. They don't know they're doing it. And, which, all right, maybe, but it doesn't get us much further. So, I went to a neo-shaman workshop once, and they were telling me, find your helper animal. And I was saying, that's kind of a disgusting idea. If you're coming from a Confucian society, you don't want to be an animal. And then the person beside me, I said I saw an old woman, dressed in the white robe, like the pictures I saw. And the guy next to me said, I went into your dream and asked her what animal she'd like to be.
Oh,
And I said, so come on, let's be respectful of each
so
other.
a shaman fundamentalist. Then.
Yeah. So yeah, let's just say, yes, I'm very aware, and depending on the encounter, mixed feelings.
Yeah.
But I'm all for spirituality where you find it, as long as you don't harm other people.
Yeah. Thank you.
I would like to ask about their knowledge or use of herbology, or even Griff mentioned acupuncture needles.
Acupuncture, yeah.
Well, when Charlie gave his presentation, he talked about the shaman giving the family some herbal medicine, I believe, right?
Yeah.
Not really. I spent a lot of time on that. Remember the spirit wedding? I showed a number of whole segment on,
Oh, I need to talk to you about that and on
Yeah.
another occasion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what is, do they have solid knowledge of herbology as part of the things they need to know, or is it just,
I think it depends on where you are studying. I've heard of shamans in Gangwon-do who, they're in a mountain environment. There's a lot of herbs around, and herbology is a part of what they do. The people I was with, they were very much in the medical system that was available around at the time. They didn't give advice, but they had a lot of patent medicine that they were taking among themselves to keep themselves perky during the kut. And the assumption was that this was not an alternative to medicine. This was what you did when the medicine wasn't working. It was something more extreme that needed better action, that a persistent illness might be one of many things that was telling you really were out of whack. Your gods and ancestors and your living family members were out of whack. And they would do things like, oh, go to a pharmacy in the West. I see a pharmacist in the pharmacy in the West, and if you go to him, he'll give you the patent medicine you need, or he'll make you the potion you need. But the people I was around weren't doing it themselves. I saw on the sidelines, not a part of the official shaman anything, but there was one shaman whose father had been a doctor of acupuncture. And I saw her doing what, some mothers do. She was pinching with a needle, pinching parts of the fingers and so on. It just a kind of folky practice, but it wasn't a part of her brief as a munchin.
in my own experience, I came to view the use of a mudang, and we can talk some more about what exactly that means. But in my experience, as I said, it was mostly to deal with an illness of some sort or some problem in the family. It didn't have to necessarily be an illness. It could be, the need to have a son, something like that, or to pass the examination. Those are also occasions to call in a mudang. But mostly in instances when there was an issue of somebody's health concerned. And I came to understand it as a way of hedging your bets. So you would take Western medicine, you would take Chinese medicine, you would get acupuncture, you would get, moxibustion, and you would go to a mudang, and you would go to a shrine at a Buddhist temple and pray to the Sanchin. And you would do all these different things, and they were all attempts to ameliorate a problem that you were trying to deal with. And it was a way, as I said, to hedge your bets.
So that herbology is not really a formal part of it then?
Well, it could be. No, it could be. That could be part of it as well. So people would go to a Chinese pharmacist, and they would take whatever herb they were given, but they would also do all of these other things as well. They didn't use the experimental method, so there was no way of knowing if they did get better, which of them worked and which of them didn't. Maybe they all worked together. So, but it was a way. It was sort of the attitude that people seem to have about dealing with adversity.
Well, yeah, but I want to reinforce this point that if you do something expensive with a shaman, it's because the physical illness becomes symptomatic of something else. And it's not being done as this is what works and that didn't. That could work very well, but it's not working because you've got an ancestor in the way. It's a kind of, I'm not sure that everyone shared this sense of causality, but when we tried to do what medical anthropologists were calling analysis of health-seeking behavior, the hierarchies of when people did things, minor illness, first indication of illness, you go to a pharmacy, and pharmacies in Korea in those days were places where you would go in and report symptoms, and they'd
Right.
give you stuff. And some
Right.
of that stuff might be very strong antibiotic. This was a great frustration to immigrants, Koreans, when I did a little bit of field work with them in Honolulu, that, can't you just give me an antibiotic? That's all I need. Then, all right, a deep chest cold that you can't shake, then you might go to the Chinese medicine, because that's, it takes a little longer, but it's more, cleaning and systemic and all over. There are certain things, certain conditions, like building up your health, that Chinese medicine is seen as being good for. Establish your balance and get your reserves. Whereas the Western medicine is seen as sort of sako pow, strong, and it deals effectively. If it isn't something, an obvious emergency, like a broken arm or a leg or something, it's, you don't go to a clinic or a hospital until like the next tier of concern of things not getting better. And then, the sum of all of these things not getting better, or conversely, something that happens very suddenly, like a fit of madness, then you would call the shamans, because that's beyond the interventions of anybody else around here. You take them to the clinic and they give them a shot, and they sleep. But it's really, the feeling is that they need something more.
I have a question. You have used the word gods and spirits.
Yeah.
That you're invoking or placating. Are you using those interchangeably?
Yeah,
Or
I'm using spirit as a blanket term, the way they did. And then specific entities I call gods. I know that's in some quarters contested, but this is a tradition in the anthropology of East Asian popular religion, that named, titled entities get called gods. It's very upsetting to Korean Christians that I do this. Dead who are known dead, who are entitled to offerings, I call ancestors. Those who aren't, I call ghosts.
is there
But
some
that's
kind
a shorthand for being able to talk, through Korea, across Korea, to people doing similar work in other places. Translation is always a problem.
Are all the spirits on the Manshin's altar, would you call all of them gods?
Oh, in the pictures here? Yeah,
Well,
I would
yeah.
Yeah, I'd call them gods, certainly.
is there some difference?
Different, how do you mean?
Well, in I don't know, the role or the what you call spirits, and then a difference in what you call gods. Is there a different function?
Well, yeah, okay. I'm thinking of shaman talk. And what they do is deal with the shin. And the shin, if they're undifferentiated, I'll probably say spirits, because when they say it, I'm assuming they mean gods and ancestors and potent ghosts as well. So I use spirit as a blanket term. It's also a term that people writing about shamans in a lot of other places use. But when we get specific, I use God and ancestor.
And just one last thing, is there some kind of the pantheon of gods, such, like with Greek mythology and so on, or just?
Yeah, they are, I think, more than a pantheon. I would call it, a bunch of roles. The Korean folklorists have been very keen to say this isn't really a hierarchy. Like there's a particular deity at the top, and then there's a tier, and then there's a tier. You get to Vietnam, and there's a very strong sense of hierarchy. There is a sense, however, of higher, well, because these gods are not one, they're many. These are titles. This is the general in this shaman's pantheon. This is the general in that shaman's pantheon. And they might say things like, my General Lee Sun Shin is better than your General Lee Sun Shin, or my General Douglas MacArthur even. Because these are the titles that spirit entities have been appointed to. And and if one thinks of them that way, then it's easier to see how one's ancestor can also pop up as a deity on the altar. They wouldn't be a deity without the title, without the position. And in the case of Youngsu's grandmother, actually supplanting another ancestor to assume that title.
Are there Christian deities as well?
Are there what?
Like Mary or John the Baptist, or do they ever appear in the shaman, the shaman?
Not in my experience, but Yunyo Su has a fascinating picture, which he says is a Mushindo, a shaman painting. And I think it's published, of Jesus Christ talking to Buddha and Confucius. And Jesus Christ is on a slightly lower plane. MacArthur comes in, the names like Isun Chin and MacArthur, this is not, I haven't encountered this with the soul style shamans, but the Hwanghae-do shamans, they have a lot of named generals, and the MacArthur cult is something really quite interesting. You know, you have General Lee Sun Shin, and you have this one and that one, and you have General Douglas MacArthur. And they sometimes annoy the local authorities by going and doing kut in front of MacArthur's statue, which is
He would have gone along with that idea, by the way. He would have gone along with that idea. He was
I'm sure he would have. Yeah.
Thank you.
Laurel, a quick question. You kind of alluded to it when you're talking about being in Gangwon-do and whatnot. Are there clear differentiations of what they're doing based upon their geographic origins? Now, I know Jeju has a slightly different tradition, but to what extent do we see this across the country? In other words, Yeongnam.
Well, the folklorists had a good time with that and did try to establish distinctions. For the Manshin, the Seoul people are very distinct from the Hwanghae-do people, who are distinct from the Pyongan-do people, who perform as refugee traditions in the Seoul area. But there's also blurring. The other, we talked about these seated kut, and that seems to be more typical of Central Korea. But that wasn't my question when I did research. How is this divided? Try to be aware of. But what I found myself studying was the Manshin tradition, and the Manshin tradition is kind of hard to see beyond because it's become so much what everybody wants to mimic. For example, I think it's in Gyeongsang-pukdo, there are women called Osal who divine, and they're not really considered shamans. They pray, they do a little bit of speaking through spirits speaking through them, but they're not really considered, well, maybe some people would call them Mudang. Now you've got me thinking, how much of Professor Im Sok-jae have I taken in? And and then there are drummers guys who would drum and try and trap malevolent spirits in bottles, okay? Different tradition. Exorcists, Hansu. Okay, all right, I encountered once in my making the rounds of Kutang, there's a guy who was a Pansu hitting the drum, and a woman who in 20, 30 years previously would have been called a Bosal but she was trying very hard to act like a Munchkin. She had a costume on and she was waving a fan somewhat awkwardly and doing, because television had taught people this is what shamans do. This is what you do if you're a Mudang. This is how you present yourself. I mean, I don't have to make this point strongly for the anthropologists. We all recognize that people are constantly borrowing from each other and improvising on each other. The Hwanghae-do shamans say that the soul style, the Hanyang shamans, Munshin, like the ones I studied, took standing on knives from them, that they never used to do it, that they borrowed it and they don't do it as well. And the soul Hanyang shamans say that some of the things the Hwanghae-do shamans do are disgusting. They eat the blood, they break a chicken's neck and eat the blood, and who would do that? It's a very, and it's more complex because you have these North Korean traditions in the capital, and they're initiating people who have like a Gyeongsang-do accent, and they have to master a chant that came from Hwanghae-do, and they talk about this difficulty. So it's a lot more fluid than any simple map and designation would lead us to think. The more so because the Korea now, unlike the Korea that folklorists were writing about in the 60s and 70s, is a much more mushed together place with, the movement to the cities, the fluidity of the population from urban center to urban center. So that what one sees could be quite complex.
To what extent, Laurel, would you say there's been not how to put it, would you say that the strength or the prevalence of belief and practice and clientele of this group has changed over time in the 50 years or so since you've been studying this? Is it just as strong now, but in a different way than it was 50 years ago? Obviously, everything is much more urban centered, but in terms of let's put it this way, in terms of the amount of business that people are doing, that the Manchin are doing, are they just as busy now as they were 50 years ago, but maybe in a different context?
I would say so. I mean, to answer that question, it depends who you talk to. If you talk to Korean Christians who are quite legion, oh, no, it all disappeared. You don't see them anymore. Well, you don't see them because they're performing in Kuttang on mountains, and the mountains are full of Kuttang that weren't there 50 years ago. And if you talk to the Munshin, it's more than ever before, more Munshin, more clients, more, people, and the business angle is very, very big. But it's different, what is it Lampedusa said, for things to stay the same, they have to change completely. And it's a very transformed practice, but it is a living, because it's living, it's transformed.
Well, we've had Laurel on stage here for almost an hour and a half, so I think maybe we should put an end to the questions. Why don't we give Laurel? That was just really informative. The questions and answers were great too. Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you so much, Laurel. And I'll send you a copy of our recording as well.
Okay, thanks a million, Frank. Thanks for setting this up. Thanks, Charlie, for getting me into this. Thanks to various old friends for being here. It's nice to see your faces. And hi, Kamali.
Come again. Yeah, I mean, this is mostly for K1s, but not exclusively.
Oh, you're an exclusive group.
So you're welcome to join us anytime.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
It was wonderful.
Thank you.